All right. Good morning. Welcome back. It's Mr. Reed coming at you live. All right. So we're going to be wrapping up communication today, doing a little punctuation. And so today's actually a relatively short lecture. Just going to be working off of one non-literary text, which is an excerpt from the Sun's editorial um, right around the time that Brexit was taking shape, and there was calls from both sides about leaving or staying. So I've just taken a small excerpt of the Sun's editorial and just a real quick read. We urge you to make history and win back freedom. Believe in yourself and our country's greatness. Vote leave. This is our last chance to remove ourselves from the undemocratic Brussels machine in the vote of a lifetime. Today you can make history by winning Britain's independence from the crushing might of the Brussels machine. We urge you to vote leave and make today our Independence Day. For many of us, it will be the first vote of our lifetimes that truly matters. This referendum is not about parliamentary seats, so many of which are safely sewn up from one party or another. Today, every vote counts equally, and your decision is yours alone. For months, you have been bombarded by propaganda for both Remain and Leave, but with the referendum now here, we say this to Sun readers: cut through all the guff. What does your gut tell you? Is leaving the EU best for your family, for your community, for your country? Okay. Um, so when we were talking about communication last class, the first thing I really like you to do is just to look at some of the literary and structural techniques that are used in a text and talk a little bit about how structure, style, and language is being used to convey a message, right? That's kind of the surface level stuff here. So let's actually look at how a writer communicates and uses creativity to represent the world in a variety of ways. Okay, so it seems like a very broad question, and we'll talk more about creativity next class. But just to kind of show you the different techniques that are being used in this particular piece and how repercussive that is in the greater readership and how people look and represent the world in different ways. Okay, so first things first, there's a lot of structural inclusion of dashes, which abrupt the flow. And because of that, anything that sort of follows a dash is what is emphasized most, right? So in this case, by winning Britain's independence from the crushing might of the Brussels machine. Lots of interesting diction here as well. Also have some dash here with vote leave. Um, Simple syntax, very simple sentence structure here. Don't be confused or misled by that, though. That's actually a very strong and powerful writing technique. Stylistic, bold use of font. Um, there's negative diction commonly used here, right? Again, the Brussels machine, that's an interesting one. Propaganda, anything that's seen as other is seen as propaganda. Bombarded, right? Such a strong verb being used there. Cut through all the guff, right? Typically used with a negative connotation. So it's not even the principles or the ideologies behind them and how they're being presented aren't seen as being concrete or informative or maybe representative of different ideologies, but rather seen as just nonsense guff, right? Um, Use of anaphora, right? Today and today, for your. We have different rhetorical strategies, mostly pathos in this particular text. And the idea here is that it's creating a sense of inclusiveness. It's empowering, right? You are able to cut through the guff, right? You are the one who's able to vote. You are the one who is able to combat the Brussels machine. Um, there's this concept of the patriotism logical fallacy, right? Which is this idea, again, that you are in control, you are spearheading for your country and for your fellow citizens. Um, we have lots of use of repetition. There's rhetorical questions near the very end here as well. This isn't really a question. This isn't trying to guilt someone. It's really almost used to empower, right? And then lastly, kind of like how we've seen in Margaret Atwood's The Moment, there's this progression of spatiality where at one end, you're considering each one of these nouns here, the family, the community, the country, but it progressively gets larger and larger and larger. And this is used as a technique to realize the space of and the time period, the context in which this was taking place, and how severe it is, right? So it's at one end to kind of push the audience through the use of fear, but also to just show the magnitude of the decision itself. It's a very powerful technique, right? So that's how an idea is being communicated, and there's lots of examples of creativity that it's being used. And then obviously the word choice and all of the other literary techniques is designed to represent one particular ideology from another. So we left off with our last class. We talked a little bit about the plurality of reading, and we looked at dominant reading, negotiated reading, oppositional reading. So here's just a quick analysis I did for this particular piece. The dominant reader most likely would agree with this text because maybe they are readers of The Sun. They would view the language and structure that is used to highlight a common agenda and designed to unify for a common cause, right? So very much kind of buys into the patriotic rhetoric and maintains the image of the country and its various successes, right? The text sways readers from propaganda from both sides, but obviously you're supposed to cut through that guff and identify with one side. So even the propaganda of the side that this particular audience is agreeing with is good propaganda, right? And propaganda can be both good and bad. It can also be neutral. We'll talk more about that next year, but just to kind of get an understanding of what propaganda is. But in the case of the opposition, this propaganda would be used to damage, if they stayed in the EU, and damage the identity of the country and potentially the reader themselves, right? So it's an attack on their sense of identity here. As we know, identity is constructed. The idealized reader, right? Someone who maybe comes into this text not reading a lot about this or really having a strong opinion, would read this and maybe find this convincing, and that thus it becomes transformative because reading is a transformative process. The negotiated reader finds some common truths within the text despite some of the tacit divisiveness. This may be the case because of finding common ground in the representation of the article's implied cultural identity. Maybe it's a sense of empowerment that they find they can gravitate to. Maybe they don't like the representation of the encroaching threat of other, right? The other people, the other party, the other viewpoints, the different ideologies. They're seen as other. So there's this sense of otherization. Yes, colonialism, right? We've been talking a little bit about that, so you could look at this through a post-colonialist lens. There's definitely some interesting points here. Maybe even some racially charged views of here, but that's more down in the oppositional reading. Or some other conceptual connections and commonalities, right? So there's quite a few different things that a negotiated reader could take away from this and agree with, but also maybe modify because they don't feel comfortable with it. Lastly, the oppositional reader, right? And this again is where we see tension coming from different audiences based on a wide variety of different reasons. But the oppositional reader would view this text and its use of divisiveness, its manipulative language, and its patriotic logical fallacies, which in turn pits the parties against each other. So it creates this binary of us versus them. It creates a mentality of otherization, right? You're either in or you are out, right? And if we are focusing on them. What is them? Well, that is a cultural representation of the ideology and people who threaten the decomposition of the country's very moral fibers, right? So the country itself and its sense of identity is under attack, right? The imminent or impeding threat to the construct of nationality, right? What it means to be British, right? Or from the UK. Or a national identity, right? And we've talked a lot about how these things are constructed, right? Either if it's the idea of nationality or the idea of identity. Obviously, a lot more you could talk about there, but and a general threat to the current social, political, and economic constructs that are status quo in that country. Right? Those are all these things are under attack right now, and they are all benefited by a small group who benefits from these things. So here you're looking at a couple different ways to approach this, right? So we could look again at that post-colonialist lens, or maybe we're looking at it through uh, the queer gender lens, or maybe we're looking at it through a more racially tinged lens, or maybe we're looking at it through a more Marxist lens. Um, but clearly, there's a difference in identity, and there's a sense of tension in how these folks are being represented culturally, um, and how that, again, is being communicated creatively. So big takeaways, last thing here. The first thing to know is that The Sun is a pretty well-known newspaper article. They have a lot of readership, so a lot of the opinions remain similar, expressed day in, day out, read by many, and so that's going to have a very large impact on how readers think and behave. The viewers expressed are quite possible in opposition to those held by many readers. It seems obvious that obviously in IB we're trying to make a more peaceful world where people kind of communicate and work together. So we do need to have an understanding of oppositional, if we disagree with this, oppositional attitudes and opinions and how they may diverge from our own. And then finally, the language of style of the editorial is at first glance deceptively simple, but as we've talked a little bit about, that's not necessarily because it's stupid or uneducated. It's very intentional. It's actually quite powerful use of language. So there you have it, communication. Next class, we'll be talking a little bit more about creativity and working on some Shelley stuff. Have a good day.